Speaking of anger, we're going to be talking about that today. So that's what we're talking about today, by the way. I'm having lunch with a couple of buddies of mine in Dallas on Wednesday, I believe it was. And the question came up about you, like, hey, let me ask you, like, how are things going? How's the church going? Tell me about what's happening at North Tarrant Church. And I got the chance to answer about you and how incredible you are. And then the question came up, well, what are you talking about this Sunday? And I told him, I said, we're in the middle of a series. It's entitled, You're Not the Boss of Me. And this week we're talking about anger. And they had the audacity to look at me and say, well, don't you know on the drive back from Dallas, you're going to have a lot of traffic. And there is a good chance either you or somebody around you is going to have road rage. I was like, thanks, dude. I appreciate that. Like, I don't want to wish that on me, and I certainly don't want to wish that on anybody around me. But isn't it true that when we think of anger, isn't the first thing that comes to mind road rage or what happens in a car? And I know we're good drivers in here, so this isn't characteristic of your driving, but we've all been victimized by road rage, haven't we? I mean, we've all had the experiences in our life where road rage has been a part of our dynamic. It's been a part of our driving, maybe not necessarily as you would think. I mean, many of us, when we think road rage, we think the crazy that's like tailing you, and all of a sudden you pull into the Walmart parking lot and he follows you, and then you're like, do I keep driving or do I pull into, I need to go to Walmart. Like I'm on a mission to get milk and the guy's still following me. And you pull out, like many of us think that's road rage, but let's be honest. I actually found a really clever definition of road rage. Road rage is really this. It's aggressive or angry behavior exhibited by a driver. And you're like, duh, but listen to how descriptive this is. And this is not you. You don't do this, okay? This is for the others that you drive with, right? The behaviors, it includes rude and offensive gestures, verbal insults, physical threats, or dangerous driving methods targeted toward another driver or pedestrian in an effort to intimidate or immediately release frustration.
That's not me.
That's none of us, right? Like, we are good drivers. This isn't true of any of us. We are victims of road rage. We are not the perpetrator of road rage, right? Like I know we're talking to a very sophisticated, a very classy audience. Like I know this isn't what happens. This isn't what you exhibit, but this is what happens around you. But isn't this fascinating? You think about road rage at its truest form. It can absolutely destroy somebody's day. It can absolutely completely turn what was supposed to be a normal Monday into an incredible, horrible, no good, very bad Monday. And it's all over a stranger, somebody they don't even know, somebody they're never going to see again in their life. And if they do, they're probably not going to remember, oh, you drive the 83 Accord. I remember, like, no. It's not what it looks like. You think about it, road rage or this idea, it's all centered around a stranger, somebody you're never going to meet, somebody that doesn't even know who you are and never going to run into you. And yet, typically, when road rage is the case, we have granted somebody else permission to ruin our day. Now, that's free of charge. So today, we're going to talk about this idea of anger, because here's what I found when it comes to anger. In fact, this definition, it's an immediate release of frustration. I mean, when you really come to grips with this idea of anger, we would like to use an easier word, right? We would rather, instead of anger, we would prefer to say that I've got frustration. It's not anger as much as it's frustration. It's not something on the inside, it's the circumstances around me. It's that stranger that was in the car, that was in front of me, that had the audacity to go 5 miles over the speed limit. Doesn't he know the flow of traffic is at least 10? What is wrong with it? Like, it's not my fault, it's the frustration. It's the circumstances around me. But what I want to talk about today is really, whether you call it frustration or not, the truth is that really it is coming from a root of anger. You might call it frustration, but really it comes from this idea that we are angry at something. Yeah, it's just frustration. Scott, you could probably come back at me and say, well, let me tell you the definition, the difference between anger and frustration. Like what I'm dealing with is absolutely frustration. Well, the truth is oftentimes, whether you call it frustration or anger, it has the propensity to get in the middle of relationships and has the opportunity to destroy the relationships that we hold so dear. So, how do we get to the bottom of it? If frustration is external, then you're saying that there's no hope. You're saying that, you know what, it's all external, it has nothing to do with me. Then really we're justifying what's going on the inside. So today, what I want us to do is I want us to look, I don't want to convince you that you're an angry person, but I want to talk about how do we get to the bottom of this idea that maybe there is a hint of anger in us. So we've been in the middle of this series entitled, You're Not the Boss of Me. And the tagline goes like this: how to say no to the emotions that compete for control. So many of us, I mean, you would probably validate the fact that there are emotions that get in the middle of us that oftentimes get the best of us. And they're competing for control. They're competing for the words you say. They're competing for the things you do. They're competing to try to get you to do things that ultimately you just kind of roll back and you say, that wasn't me. I didn't mean to say that. That it just slipped out. I'm so sorry. But what we've talked about over the last several weeks is you can't really just say that I'm sorry, that when we are shaken up, what comes out is oftentimes indicative of what's on the inside. That what comes out, while we might say, I didn't mean to say it, it's actually what's being stored on the inside. Jesus said it best. He told us, and this is kind of where we got our marching orders for the series. When talking about the things that go in and the rituals and the laws that were in the old covenant, he began to say, but it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles an individual. What comes into your mouth just goes out of your body. But what actually defiles an individual is what comes out of the heart. And so we wanted just to pause for a few weeks and talk about how do we really get to the bottom of what's in our heart. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at guilt and how guilt has a way of getting inside our lives and really wrecking shop in our relationships. And last week, we looked at envy, and we looked at how envy can, if we're not careful, it can lead us to really begin to compare ourselves to everybody else. And what happens when we compare ourselves to everyone else? We never live up to the potential of what we were called to live up to. We were never able to live up to who we've been created to be because we're constantly comparing ourselves to somebody else's journey. So today we want to look at this one idea called anger. We want to talk about anger. Because here's what I know is when it comes to anger, nobody ever wants anger to be the boss of them. Nobody ever wants anger to be the boss of them. Isn't that true? I mean, if I were to ask your loved ones, if I were to ask your spouse, if I were to ask your kids, if I were to ask your colleagues, your coworkers, hey, do you really want anger to be the boss of that individual? Nobody would want anger to be the boss of them. Nobody, if they were really honest, would want that. Yet oftentimes in our life, we see that we do have a little bit of anger inside of us. We've got this idea that at times anger gets the best of us. So today, what we're going to talk about is anger. And one of the ways to really to wrestle with this idea of anger is to break it apart. You've got extroverted anger and you've got introverted anger. And the truth is, we all know what extroverted anger is. You've seen it. You've heard it. You've been hurt by it. We've all seen extroverted anger where the words that come out, the deeds that we do, they tend to open up scabs and open up very deep hurts. And for some of us, extroverted anger from many, many years ago is still very raw in our hearts. But there's another side of it, this introverted anger. Introverted anger is really, we don't deem it as bad because it's silent. But the truth is, in many instances, the moodiness that we have can be just as deafening as the extroversion that we see. The silence, the way that we just shut down at times, can be just as damaging to a relationship as the finger-pointing vocal outlash. So whether you shove it down or you shove it out, I want us to look at this idea of anger. Now, I want to take a few moments just to kind of pick apart two different types of anger. We've talked introverted and extroverted. There is a kind of anger that can be a good thing, and this isn't what we're talking about today, but this idea, and we'll term it Crusader anger. This idea that something outside has caused you to be so angry that you are willing to go to great lengths to fight for and to fight on behalf of injustices in our world. And Crusader anger has been a very positive thing in our community and in our culture. Crusader anger has helped us fight women's suffrage. It's helped us to really establish great laws when it came to child labor laws. And it's helped helped us make incredible strides when it comes to the civil rights movement. This idea of Crusader anger is a valuable anger, but here's what I know about the two, what I've seen in the two, Crusader anger versus the internal anger. You see, Crusader anger, it is built around what others aren't getting that they deserve. There is somebody else that is not getting the very thing that I know they deserve. They deserve a voice. They deserve equality. They deserve to have somebody in their corner. They're not getting what they deserve, and I'm angry about it. And that's a good thing. That's not what we're talking about today. Because the other side, and what I really want to get into, the side that destroys relationships, is the type of anger that ultimately it begins when I'm not getting the very thing that I'm sure that I deserve. There's a difference between they're not getting what they deserve and I'm not getting what I deserve. So today, what I want us to do is we're going to look at a passage from James. James, who's the brother of Jesus, which, by the way, what would it take for you? What would it take for you to believe that your brother is the Son of God? I mean, you just think about that for a second. So anytime I like to reference James, I like to think about this idea that James was the brother of Jesus. He spent his whole life living in his shadow, thinking, I can never measure up. I can never do enough. There's no way that I can ever gain my mom's approval because, well, my brother is Jesus. So I think he has a little bit to say about anger. But James, not only that, after Jesus died and came back to life after the resurrection, James completely decided that I'm going to be a follower of my brother. I'm going to give my life on account that my brother was exactly who he claimed to be. And he went on to be the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And James wrote a little letter that's in the New Testament, a letter that is so profound, and it gives very good marching orders about what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus. And James has a principle that I think we can really kind of tinge out a little bit today as we look at anger. So James chapter 3, verse 13, he says this, who is wise and understanding among you? And that's a question for the audience. Who's wise? And James knows, and we see that wisdom is ultimately this interconnection. Wisdom is the idea that you can step back from your life and see that everything within your life is connected. That everything that's happened has happened and it's interconnected. I can learn from, I can glean from, I can lean in, and I can become a better person because I have experienced life and I have an understanding that everything is connected. So James is saying, who is wise among you? And he goes on and he says, let them show it by their good life. Who's wise? Show it by the good life that you live. Show it by the deeds that you've done in humility that comes from wisdom. You know, one of the things that James is pulling out right off the bat, that wise people are humble. Wise people always have an attitude of humility about them. Truth be told, when you see somebody that's arrogant, when you interact with somebody, if you have a boss that's arrogant, and none of y'all are, I know that, but when you interact with arrogance, you're not sitting there thinking, they are so wise. You're sitting there thinking, they really think the world revolves around them. They really think that regardless of their past decisions, they can overcome the interconnectedness of life. He's looking at it and he's saying, let them show their wisdom by their good life, by the deeds done in humility. In other words, you want to show your wisdom? Be humble. You want to show you're wise? Remember that life isn't all about you, but the yous beside you. You see, humility is definitely not natural in our life. Humility is a difficult thing for us to come by. And James understands that. So he presses on, and he goes on in verse 14, and he says this: but if you harbor, if you dock, if you allow envy and selfish ambition to dock itself in your heart, if you allow it just to sit and wrestle and rest in your heart, what happens? We talked about envy last week. You begin to see what everybody else sees, and you begin to get bitter about the fact that they have something that you don't have. And you begin to process it and think about it and think about it. And all of a sudden, you begin to stew over it. And what happens? Selfish ambition, it runs through your heart. There's no humility in it because we think we deserve things. Life isn't fair. I deserve it. I need to continue pursuing. I need to fight for. I need to go forward. And James continues in 3:4. He says, do not boast about it or deny the truth. In other words, it's kind of weird. I mean, why did you, do not let it harbor in your hearts and do not boast about it. In other words, don't go around saying, I can do it. I've got it. I've got it all together. There's nothing you can worry about. I'm good. You see, the hurdle is and the struggle is for all of us is James is challenging us, don't be stuck. Don't be satisfied. Don't just allow yourself to constantly look at everybody else and sit there and rest in that reality that this is just not going to be. You see, God has called you to something better. God has called you to live a life better than you can ever imagine. And what we find ourselves is when we allow anger at times to dock in our hearts, we get stuck on the bitter envy of what's happening around us. We get stuck on selfish ambition, believing that everything revolves around me. And so James isn't through. He continues in verse 16. He says, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, you ready for this? Where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. It's another way of him quoting his brother by saying, what comes from the heart is malice and murder and envy. I mean, that's what Jesus said. James just decides to make it a little bit more palatable, right? Where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. In other words, when you have arrogance lodged in your heart, when arrogance gets lodged in there and we begin to think that we are the center of our world, we will find that there is disorder and there's practice. There's evil practice all around us. We will find that life tends to not make sense. We try to get the ball rolling and we're like, oh, I'm gonna do better next time, I'm gonna do better next time. And we never let humility or wisdom work itself out. We're constantly trying to not allow anybody to see our failure and our frustrations. We're not allowing anybody to see the hurt. We're constantly in this rat race. And what we've been talking about is what's on the inside is going to come out. When we get shaken, what happens is we tend to expose the very thing that's on the inside. And so James he's telling us, he's walking this idea. He's trying to encourage you on how you can keep anger from getting lodged in your heart. He's trying to encourage you on how you can help keep anger from destroying the relationships. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of this, he pauses and he asks a question. He begins to lean in a little bit. He says, okay, we've talked about humility. We've talked about this idea that if you're not careful, arrogance is going to get the best of you. So let me ask you, what causes fights? What is it that causes fights? You think you know everything, and James is encouraging his church. You think you've got everything together. I've just told you that when we have envy and selfish ambition lodged in our heart, every evil practice comes from that. So what do you think causes fights? And what causes quarrels among you? To which probably If you're like me, you'd push back and be like, hold up, no. It's not a what, it's a who. Do you realize the way my 9th grade boy treats me? Like, it is a who. My 9th grade son, he is so ridiculous. Like, there is nothing good in him, and I'm trying to just encourage him. And you want to know what causes the fights in our house? It's not a what, it's a... Have you seen the way that my spouse treats me? Like, you don't understand, Scott. This idea, it's not a what. There's no way it's a what. Have you seen how arrogant my boss is? I mean, he walks in and expects me to have a triple latte, whatever, on his desk. And if I don't have it, I'm toast. It's not a what, it's a who. But James knew that there was that pushback. And as long as we're trying to define the what, as long as the what is more important than the who, what happens is we justify our anger and we push it to other people, and we don't take ownership of our slice of the pie. So James continues on. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? Doesn't the fights and quarrels come from the desires that are inside of you? No, James, you don't understand. It's a who. I mean, it comes from this idea that I'm not getting my way. It comes from this idea that yeah, I want to be humble. I desperately don't want people to think that I am the center of my world. But if I'm honest, there are times that I'm not getting what I want. If there's times I'm not getting what I feel I deserve, I'm not getting my way. And James is saying the quarrels and fights that are among you, they come from your desires that stir within you. This idea that my way is always right. And what James is saying is he's kind of talking to everybody. He's saying we need to embrace what is our piece of the pie. Yes, there are other people that probably have wronged you, and we're not giving them a pass. But odds are there's a piece of the pie that you can hold on to. There's a piece of the pie that you need to take ownership of. This can be life-changing when we really begin to think about it. I mean, you think about the relationships you have, maybe with a significant other, with a spouse, with a child, with a grown-up child, and you're trying to work in this idea of reconciliation. And the truth is that there's so much going on the backside. And to a certain degree, you're still holding on to what they did, and you're not willing to take ownership of the piece of the pie that is yours. And for many of us, we've allowed anger to be the boss of us. And so James continues, and he continues to talk about this idea and trying to challenge us and trying to stir us to think about what this really looks like. And in verse 2, James makes this statement right here. Sorry. I just skipped it. No, it's really not. No, hey. He makes this statement. He says, you desire, but you do not have. So you kill. You're like, wait a second. I don't do that. That's not in me. I'm not going to kill anybody. But isn't it true that, sure, maybe this is a little bit of hyperbole, but isn't it true that the desires that we have, the things that we desperately want, when we don't get it, at times we go to extreme measures to get our way? At times we'll be willing to do things that are relatively ridiculous. We desire, but we do not have, so what do? We get angry. We push relationships away. We begin to set bars and set boundaries. We begin to get frustrated because I'm not getting what I want. And he continues on and he says this. He says, you are envious and you cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel. He says, you're envious and you cannot obtain, So you fight, you quarrel, you get frustrated, you get angry. You let this really settle on the inside. So what do? You begin to fight other people. And James is like, right, I get that. I already told you. So what causes the fights? The thing on the inside. You're envious. You cannot contain it. So you just let it explode. And isn't it true that the source of our anger in many instances is me not getting what I want? It's me not getting the very thing that I believe I deserve. And I know the pushback is this, Scott, wait a second, this isn't okay. Like, I'm not that selfish. I'm not that ridiculous. But Scott, you don't understand. You see, I'm not getting what I want. It's not that simple. I earned it. I fought for it. I paid the price. I earned this thing, whether it's the corner office, whether it's a better relationship. I earned that car. Regardless of what it is, if you don't get what you want, isn't it true that if you don't get what you feel like you earned, you want the very thing that you feel like you earned, and so you're not getting what you want. But maybe you might feel like I deserve this. I was promised this reality. I was promised that you would be home every single day at 5 p.m., and you have not been home at all, at 5 p.m. I was promised that it would be different this time. I was promised that you would not be on Facebook. I was promised that once I got into this job 3 months later, I would be fast-tracked to the next position. I was promised, but isn't it true that when we begin to think about what we were promised, we want what we were promised? So we're not getting what we want? Or maybe it's not I was promised or I earned, but maybe I'm not getting, it's not fair. I'm not getting the very thing that is fair. But isn't it true that we all want justice? We want to fight for what is right. And deep down inside, when we think about fairness went out in the Garden of Eden, really. There's nothing in life that's fair. I'm trying to teach my boys this, but that's hard. But yet as an adult, we look at life and we begin to think that this isn't fair. I want what is fair. I am owed what is fair. So ultimately, isn't it true? We don't get what we want. Now, here's just something I want to encourage you with and challenge you with. When we really begin to think about this, when you feel anger rising up on the inside, when you begin to be in an argument and you see, oh my goodness, this isn't okay. I feel that anger is creeping up and I feel like this is not going to go well. And maybe you are extroverted when it comes to anger and you just like to erupt. Maybe you're more introverted when it comes to anger and you're like, okay, I need to shut down. I want to encourage you and I want to challenge you because this is something that I really believe can change the dynamic of any argument. And oftentimes it's a who on the other side of the anger inside of us. And if we're not careful, we will lash out at the who. And so this is kind of a showstopper. This will really help you, I believe. And I want to encourage you. When you find yourself allowing anger to rise up within you, just pause for a second. Say, time out. Step back. And I want you to say this. You know what part of the problem is, don't you? And if you say that, they are going to pause and be like, yeah, I do know what it is. It's you. And you validate it. I'm not getting what I want. You think about it. If you're in the middle of an argument and you're trying to figure out, oh my goodness, anger's getting the best of me. Anger, you are not the boss of me. I'm not gonna let anger get the best of me. I'm not gonna let anger get the best of me. But I realize I earned it. It's mine. I deserve this. Yeah, I want the very thing that I feel like I earned. Therefore, I'm not getting what I want. Okay, pause. You know what part of the problem is, don't you? I'm not getting what I want. Talk about looking at the face on the other side of the person. They'll be like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? How, you're right. That's what the problem, and just leave it at that. You're not getting what you were promised. You're right. I know what part of the problem is. I'm not getting what I want. So I want to ask you a question. I want to pull out of what James had to say because James continues to talk about this idea of humility. That ultimately, that being humble, being wise is realizing that I need to take part, I need to take responsibility of my part. So I want to ask you a simple question. What is your relationship with anger? When you really think about it, what is your relationship with anger? Is anger the boss of you? When you find that one person, do you allow the anger to get the best of you? Do you find yourself to be moody at times around certain individuals? Do you find at times that when anger gets the best of you, when anger is the boss of you, that what comes out of the mouth begins to spew? Do you find that anger is the boss of you? Because part of the problem with when we really get down to it is this idea that we've allowed anger to settle in and we've not allowed humility to really take root because we see what everybody else has and what we desperately want. So, what is your relationship with anger? And when you find anger really rising up, will you be willing to ask or to make the declaration that anger, you are not the boss of me? Anger, I don't care what I want and what I'm not getting. Anger, you are not the boss of me. Yes, I know I earned it, and he's a jerk, and she's not doing what I've asked, and this is not okay. I was promised this, and we begin to get worked up, and would we just stop for a minute and be like, hey, wait, this is my piece of the pie. I'm not gonna let anger get the best of me. And anger, you are not the boss of me. Besides, I really believe that as a follower of Jesus, we have a better boss. When it comes to our opportunity in our lives, anger doesn't have to be the boss of us because we have a better boss, Jesus Christ. Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is the crazy thing, is Jesus, he was probably the most humble individual who gave everything on your behalf. I mean, of anybody in the world that's ever lived a perfect life, probably none of us. Maybe one. No. But of all of us, Jesus is the only one who really has the credential, the weight to be able to wag the finger and begin demanding and begin proclaiming that I deserve, you haven't kept your promise. In fact, Paul, who was an incredible leader, he was a church planter, and he documented Jesus. He had a very interesting perspective of Jesus. Because when Jesus was on the earth, he was training to be a good rabbi. And so he saw this guy from afar, and he heard the stories. And when he saw this guy get crucified and then come back to life, he didn't get a chance to really experience Jesus when he was here, but he saw the effects of the individuals, the courage and the boldness that they had. And so Paul decided, he took it upon himself to eliminate these followers of Jesus. And he did a really good job. In fact, if you're in here and you don't like followers of Jesus, you don't like Christians at all, you and Paul would be in really good company. But listen to what Paul said about Jesus, leaning in, learning from these individuals that had followed him so closely. Paul, in his letter to Philippi, he says this, talking about Jesus, he says, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. If anybody could have walked into the local coffee shop in Nazareth and said, I want that table, you need to make a move, I'm the Son of God, it was Jesus. If anybody ever wanted to leverage his position, it was Jesus. But Paul saw something special in Jesus, that humility reigned supreme in his heart. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Isn't it true that so much of our anger is rooted in the idea that we think we're better than we are? We think we deserve more. We think we should get the very thing that we believe we deserve. And isn't it true that when we begin to leverage that anger, it breaks relationships? And Paul knew that. And he said this of Jesus in this passage. He says, in your relationships with one another, in other words, in your relationships, especially those that matter, those that are closest to us, those that we have the propensity, if you would, to just spew barbs of anger at your kids, your spouse, and you begin to say, I didn't mean it, it was a bad day. I hate that I said that. I really didn't mean to say that. He's saying, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. In the relationships that you have with your colleagues, with your family, with your spouse, have the same relationship, have the same attitude as Jesus Christ. Jesus could have very easily leveraged his position, his power. He could have leveraged the things he believed he deserved, but he didn't. He stepped back. He saw how everything was connected. And rather than letting anger get the best of him, he waded into humility. That's so difficult. It's so unnatural, but it can be life-changing. When we follow after Jesus, one of the greatest things is choosing to put others before self, because Jesus did that very thing. And when we begin to see others as more important than ourselves, anger doesn't have a hold in our heart. Anger doesn't have a place. It doesn't have a foothold. It can't begin to ruin relationships because we realize our place in life. We realize the value of relationships and the struggle that anger can bring. So, my question, what relationship do you have with anger? And just like this whole series, one of the things I want to encourage you is we want to give you some questions to really process this. Because I know good and well, we talk about anger, probably all of us have a little bit of anger inside of us. We probably all have a little bit of struggle and angst just talking about it. Because we live in a world where I am supreme. I mean, to champion humility is almost countercultural. But isn't it true that Jesus was countercultural? And he changed the world. And I just believe this can change the world one relationship at a time. So some questions to process for you to think about. Maybe you want to snap a picture of it or take it with you or text one of these to a spouse or a friend. But let me ask you, describe your relationship with anger. That makes great lunch conversation before the Super Bowl, doesn't it? You know what my relationship with is? I'm not a fan of this cowboy coach. What in the world? I mean, describe your relationship with anger. Do you shout out or do you shut down? When it comes to anger, do you shout out or do you shut down? What or who are your triggers? What or who are the triggers that you find yourself in? And then last but not least, are you ready to acknowledge that part of the problem is you're not getting what you want? Are you willing to acknowledge that I have a piece to play, I have a place to reside? And humility is more important than anger. Humility says, this is my slice, and I'm going to take ownership of it. Let's pray. God, we love you. God, I thank you for road rage because at times, God, it reminds us of the fact that so many times in our life, we allow people to get the best of us. And we allow the trivial things in our life to really cause significant divides in the relationships that matter the most. And so, God, I pray that you would give us the courage, Father, to take the anger inside of us and begin processing. How can we turn the anger into humility? And God, I pray that you would give us the boldness that when we are faced with a difficult scenario and it is a what, and we feel that I am not getting what I want rising up, God, give us the courage to pause and remind ourselves that the problem in this argument is that I'm not getting what I want. God, those are massive steps that can lead us to humility. And God, we want to be like you. We want to look like you. We want to have our lives showcase you. And you, being humble, is critical in our journey. So God, we love you. God, we need you. And we thank you. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.